Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today, let's do some more fantasy book recommendations. So this is episode 2 in my Ultimate Fantasy Rec video series. I already did my beginner fantasy books that I highly recommend for those of you who may have never really read any fantasy books at all in your life. Maybe you're just a big fan of fantasy shows or other forms of media and you're wanting to dip your toes into the fantasy genre but don't know where to start. I have that video linked for you down below. This video is a little bit different where we are going to be talking about recommendations for those of you who read maybe a lot of YA fantasy, but you don't yet know where to really begin with adult fantasy. You feel intimidated a little bit by it, but you're very familiar with fantasy tropes from YA. So I have some recommendations here for those of you who love your YA fantasy and you're wanting to start to kind of dip your toes into adult fantasy. So let's go ahead and get started. The first book recommendation I have for you is A Darker Shade of Magic by V.E. Schwab. This one is very popular, very well known in the fantasy community. It is about a character who lives in a world where there are 3 different versions of their world, and each version of that world has different levels of magic. And we have a main character named Kel who can hop between these different worlds. So it's a really, really cool premise, and I know that there are a lot of mixed reviews on this series. I personally really enjoyed it, and why I think it's great for YA fantasy readers is because the pacing, it doesn't take too long to get going. It's set somewhat in our world where we're following a character who hops between parallel Londons, so there's not a whole lot of crazy intense world building that's very dense and hard to follow. Like, it's very straightforward in its world building. The idea of levels of magic being really the only main driving difference between these worlds is quite unique. The characters themselves feel very age appropriate. They're not quite teenagers, but they're younger adults who definitely act that way. So I think that the level of maturity in these books is appropriate for the characters that you follow. And there's nothing really explicit in these books. So if you read your YA because you don't like all of the, maybe the gore or the violence or some of maybe the more steamy content, you don't have to worry about that in this book. It really doesn't go too far into any of those more explicit things. So I highly recommend this one for YA readers. The next one I mentioned to Sanderson in my beginner fantasy RECS, which I had mentioned Mistborn there, and I could have mentioned Mistborn here as well. Honestly, that acts as a great bridge book between YA and adult as well. But another one by Sanderson, so that I don't repeat myself, is Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson. So this one is the one I chose for this video because I think a big thing in YA fantasy is they usually have some level of romance in them. You're usually going to YA fantasy for maybe a romance subplot. And depending on your preference, you may like a little bit more romance, a little bit less, but Warbreaker, I think, has Sanderson's best romance that he has written ever. I love the romance subplot in this book, and that's why I picked it for this video. So the actual world building is also really, really cool in this one. The magic system, if you know Sanderson, you probably know him for his really cool, unique, hard magic systems, and this one definitely has a really cool magic system in it that I think any fantasy fan can really sink their teeth into and enjoy. Characters, you're mainly following 2 sisters who are a little bit younger, and they are just so much fun to follow. I love exploring their relationship independent of each other and together. But again, I just love the romance in this one. So if that's something that you look for, maybe you don't like your romance to take over the fantasy story, but you like just a little bit of a subplot there, this is a great one. So highly recommend for YA readers. The next one I have is Uprooted by Naomi Novik. This is one that I've also seen a lot of mixed reviews on, but overall I thought it was pretty good. This one is very fairy tale-like. The whole premise is you have a character who lives in this village near these woods, and basically this village has to sacrifice one of their young women every, I think, 10 years to appease this like dragon lord who resides near them so that the woods next to their village don't kind of take over and and destroy their village. And you're following a character who kind of gets sacrificed to that dragon lord. And I just really enjoyed the writing in this one. I thought it was really well written and I really liked the atmosphere. I think that this is a good one for YA readers because even though the pacing's a little bit slower maybe than you would find in a YA fantasy book, I think the level of world building is kind of on par, where it's not super dense world building that you're having to sit through. And the actual romantic subplot that is kind of present there, as well as just following this really awesome main character who I really enjoyed getting to explore a lot more. So for those reasons, I do think that this one could appeal to a lot of YA readers. The next one I have is a pretty short fantasy book, so if you don't want to pick up a huge tome and you would rather have a quicker read, it is Never Die by Rob J. Hayes. So this is actually a standalone fantasy novel. There are some spin-off novels from this one, but this acts as a standalone, and you're following a character who is on a mysterious quest where he is resurrecting from the dead these ancient legends from these old stories who were ultimate epic warriors. And when he resurrects them, those warriors are kind of tied to him in a way, so they have to kind of obey his command in order to remain undead, if you will. It's an awesome premise, and the reason I think that this is great for YA readers is, again, it's nothing too explicit and the pacing is fantastic. I really liked how quickly this moved. It really did read almost like a video game where you're on this really cool quest with this young mysterious character who has very mysterious motivations, and it's just a cool premise. There's nothing too adult about this book that would hold back younger readers or even just YA readers from enjoying this book. I think it's just a ton of fun, and the pacing's great, the action scenes are great. So if you're looking for a quicker, fun fantasy read, this is a good one to pick up. The next one I have is one that actually does get labeled quite a bit as young adult. It is an adult novel, but that is The Bear and the Nightingale by Katherine Arden. So obviously, because a lot of people mistakenly think this is YA, I do think it's a great bridge book between YA and adult. The reason I think it gets labeled as young adult quite a bit by some reviewers is because you're following a character named Vassia who is younger when the story starts out, and you're kind of seeing her come of age, kind of figure out herself and her powers. There is a romantic subplot, very minor, but there is that present throughout this series, which again, I think YA readers might enjoy. I definitely did. The world building itself, again, is nothing too intense or extravagant. You're kind of following what feels like our world with some magic sprinkled in. Again, it has this very fairy tale-like quality to it. It has a great atmosphere that it builds up. I actually think this first book might be the slowest paced one. It's a little bit quieter. It's not quite as expansive as the next two books in the series that really expand upon the world, get a lot more political, and get a lot more action heavy, I would say. This first book's much quieter. That's why I think a lot of people think of this as YA. It very much feels like a classic coming of age story, but I think it's just written so well, and I think the series just gets better and better as you go on. So this is a great one for YA readers. Then another one that I am not gonna lie, I am surprised that this one is adult fantasy. It is adult. I did double check. It is published as adult and it is on adult shelves. However, I definitely think it's just as great for YA shelves and YA readers, and that's Daughter of the Moon Goddess by Sue Lynn Tan. I actually originally thought this was young adult when I picked it up. This one feels like a classic YA fantasy book where you have a character who is definitely coming of age in this book. There is a love triangle that very much is a lot of the focus of the book, so it's very romance heavy. So if you like that in your fantasy books, this is a fantastic one for you. The pacing, it's very quick. You have an immortal character, so years pass differently for her, where you're definitely doing some time jumps in this, which makes it feel like it's a much faster paced book. So again, I think that this one, even though it's on adult shelves, it can absolutely be considered a fantastic book for YA fantasy readers as well. I loved all of the Chinese mythology in this one. I thought it was beautifully written, and unfortunately it didn't work quite as well for me in terms of just like the character development and the relationships not being quite as developed as I was hoping that they would be, so this wasn't my personal favorite, but I know a lot of other people who absolutely love it, and I think if you like a little bit more of a romance-heavy fantasy, you might appreciate this one a lot more than I did. The next one I have to mention, I actually mentioned this author and another series on my beginner fantasy video. That is Michael J. Sullivan's Age of Myth, which is the first book in the Legends of the First Empire series. A lot of the same reasons I mentioned his Rhaeria Revelations on my beginner fantasy video. The world building itself is not that complex. We really are just focusing on 3 fantasy races, one being humans, which I guess is not a fantasy race, that's us. Humans, elves, and dwarves. So those are the 3 main races that you're following, and the world building is fascinating, and it's introduced to you slowly so that you're not reading these huge dense paragraphs of like info dumping world building on you. Like, it's introduced slowly. As you go through the series, you'll find out more and more and more about the gods of this world and the mythology behind it, which I personally love. So I love that it's a slower introduction into the world so that you're not bogged down with it at the beginning of the series. But the characters themselves are what makes this series so fantastic, in my opinion. I absolutely love every single character. There are some characters that you will hate and that will make you so angry. There are characters that you are absolutely going to love. There are younger characters, there are older characters, so it's just this really wide variety of different characters and personalities and backgrounds. It's all so well done. So I can't recommend this series enough. I think it's fantastic for YA readers. There's nothing really explicit in these books that could hold back a younger reader from enjoying them, so highly recommend checking out Legends of the First Empire. It's probably one of my favorite fantasy series of all time at this point. The next one I have is Foundry Side by Robert Jackson Bennett. This is a fantastic book for YA readers because once again you're following a younger character named Sanchia who is a thief, and at the very beginning of this book comes upon an object during a heist that ends up having a lot more significance than she originally thought, and she kind of gets wrapped up in this larger conspiracy because she comes to be in possession of this really mysterious and powerful object. And in this world, there's a hard magic system that is so cool to explore. And I just think this cast of characters, they feel like the classic like band of misfits getting together to pull off the heist, and I just love this story in this world. So I think it's a great one for YA fantasy readers. It's got a little bit of humor, it's got a teeny little bit of romance that develops a little bit more in the second book, and the magic just makes it a ton of fun. So highly recommend this one. Another one I have is Nevernight by Jay Kristoff. Now this one does get a little bit more explicit in terms of just the violence, the level of gore, and the steaminess. There are some steamy scenes, so just kind of warning you of those things. But the reason I'm putting it for a great bridge book between YA fantasy and adult fantasy is because the main character, Mia, she is quite young when the story begins, and she's basically looking for revenge for the death of her parents. She's just this really kick-ass character that a lot of people love. Jay Kristoff's writing itself, you're either going to love it or hate it. It's very moody, if you will. I don't know the best way to describe it, but once you start reading it, you'll either really connect to it or you won't. And I think that that will make or break how you feel about this series. I personally thought it was fun, so I enjoyed this series overall, but I do see a lot of people who typically read YA fantasy also really enjoy this book, so I definitely think that if you're a YA fantasy reader who likes faster pacing, who likes following those younger characters kind of come of age, come to know their powers a bit more, this is a great one. Just know that it does have a little bit of that explicit content in it that some of these other series do not. So if you read YA fantasy to escape that, maybe don't pick this one up, but if you read YA fantasy because you don't love like the crazy complex world building, I think that this is a good one. The next one I have is Kings of the Wyld by Nicholas Eames. This is a great one because even though it follows a cast of characters that are all kind of past their prime, they're older now, they're all retired from being warriors, they're kind of coming and getting the group gathered back together again to save one of the character's daughters. And I think that this is a great one for YA readers because, again, the world building is not super intense, it's not super complex, and it just doesn't feel like it takes itself too seriously. Kind of feels like it's poking fun at some of those traditional fantasy tropes. So I think if you're a seasoned fantasy reader, but just more in the YA space, you'll notice those tropes that it's kind of poking fun at, and you'll appreciate it a lot more knowing those tropes. But it's also just like quick paced, it's fun characters, it's a lot of humor, so this is just a good one for like a really fun time if you're just looking for like a lighthearted fantasy book. You don't need all of the crazy epic dramatic stuff going on and you're just looking to have a good time. This is a really fun one to check out. The last one I own physically that I have to mention is House of Earth and Blood by Sarah J. Maas, which I don't even know if this really needs any other explanation behind it. Sarah J. Maas writes a lot of YA books and now a lot of adult books. So her writing itself feels very much like writing you would find in YA books. I mean, you can find it there. It is in YA books. So her writing style doesn't really change when she writes in the adult space. This one, the thing I think that makes it more adult is the level of complexity of the plot itself. But beyond that, there really isn't much that is making this one like more adult than like say Throne of Glass. So if you like Sarah J. Maas, like if you like Throne of Glass, but you've kind of been putting off her adult series because you're just not sure if it's gonna be too complicated or whatever, I'm here to reassure you that that's not the case. You can absolutely pick this one up. I think YA readers would really enjoy it. And if you're hesitant because you aren't sure how steamy it's gonna get, honestly, this one does not get that steamy. So I don't know about the second one yet. I haven't read it yet. But this one itself really doesn't have much explicit content at all. So I don't see any reason why a YA reader couldn't pick this up and really enjoy it. I have two more suggestions that I don't actually physically own because I personally didn't love them, but I still wanted to shout them out, give you the recommendations because I do still think that they're great bridge books for YA to adult fantasy. The first being Rage of Dragons by Evan Winter. This is one that follows a character named Tao, where after something happens to someone he knows, he is after revenge. And it is a classic revenge plot. If you like revenge plots, look no further than Rage of Dragons. The reason I think it's good for YA fantasy readers, once again, there's not much explicit content that would hold back a younger reader from enjoying it. The world building is not super complicated. The magic and the way characters can use magic is not very complicated. It's pretty straightforward writing, and the main character himself his motivations are very easy to follow. Like, he is just out for revenge. That's it. That's personally why I didn't love it, was I didn't love the main character. I felt it was just a little bit repetitive. The actual plot is very fast-paced. There's a ton of training sequences. So if you like that kind of thing, this is definitely a great book to check out. The last one I have is a classic fantasy series that so many people love. You've probably heard of it. It's The Eye of the World by Robert Jordan, the first book in the Wheel of Time series. This is a great YA to adult fantasy book. It's a great bridge book because, once again, I feel like a broken record. There is no explicit content that would hold back a YA reader from picking this up and absolutely loving it. I will say the biggest thing to note here that is not as present in any of the other books I mentioned is the more dense world building. This world and the way it's introduced is a lot more dense than any of the other books. The writing style itself just wasn't my personal preference, but if you like getting lost in these amazing epic fantasy worlds, if you like knowing every detail about that world and really digging in and dissecting every piece of that world, this is a great fantasy world to dive into. It has a younger cast of characters that are all kind of coming of age, finding out more about themselves and their place in the world. And it's got this great found family aspect, and it's got really cool like mythology and history of the world behind it. So if you like all that stuff, this is a great series to pick up. And it's one that I can definitely see why younger readers would also get really, really into it. So definitely think it's a great bridge book and would highly recommend if that sounds like it is your taste. So those are all of the recommendations I have for YA to adult fantasy books. What did you think of this list? And I, of course, have not read every fantasy book under the sun. So if you also have any recommendations that would be great bridge books between YA and adult fantasy, leave those comments down below. Thank you all so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you'd like to, and I will see you all in my next one. Bye.